All right, welcome to our um what is this book called? Our Thoughts Determine Our Lives book club. Tonight we're going to be talking about chapter 3 on humility, and it's actually a fairly short chapter, um but I think that'll be good since we've had a couple weeks here. Last time we talked about the family life, God's design for the family, obedience, parenthood, youth, duty, and we really saw how we can make the most of our time and how we can make the most of our family life. And so, how you can make the most of your time as a child to your relationship to your parents and parents' relationship to your children, how to make the most of these relationships for God. Then last week, um, we had a concert here at the bookstore, and it was really an excellent time for those who participated in that. So I wanted to give a shout out to Daniel Oberreiter and his band, The Thirsting. But tonight we're going to be talking about humility, which is the fathers call humility the root and sum of all the virtues. For example, St. Augustine said that the beginning and end of all virtues is humility. So, we're going to talk about how to become humble. And so, starting on page 87, I was very keen to learn what the life of those who served God wholeheartedly was like. So, when I was younger, I liked to leaf through the works of the Holy Fathers, and I saw their inner state. They themselves described this. You see, we only live on the outside, and we see the stream of life passing by. However, the inner life of every individual is not the same. I had a desire to learn about the inner life of those who had a perfect life on earth and who were glorified by God both here and in eternity. It was then that I realized, as the Holy Fathers themselves explained, that the perfection of the Christian life consists in extreme humility. So, extreme humility. Well, this is very difficult to achieve because humility cuts at the heart of all sin, and it cuts at the heart of all sinfulness that still dwells in us. It cuts at the heart of our self will, and it cuts at the heart of our self justifications and everything that is wrong in us. Humility is a powerful answer to all of that, but that also makes it the most difficult of all the virtues because it's the most self effacing. And interestingly, I think we should note that this is actually something very unique to Christianity. Most ancient people did not see the value in humility. The very fact that we value humility comes to us from Christian thought. When you read ancient pagan writings, they were not into humility. They were into, Julius Caesar, and they saw it as very virtuous that Julius Caesar was a proud man because he lived up to his pride. And so they did not see it necessarily as a value to be humble. They saw it as a value to be proud and then to achieve that which you were proud of, I guess. But Jesus showed us a different way. In Philippians 2 1 through 11, Jesus showed us the path of humility. St. Paul tells us that Jesus' example is that of being the King of glory, the God of the universe, and was equal to God the Father, and yet willingly laid aside his glory. And this is something that the demons cannot comprehend. I was reading an interesting patristic book the other day, and it talked about the fact that this is why Satan was ultimately defeated at the cross, because Satan could not comprehend what Christ was doing. He could not comprehend the idea. Satan could only understand conquering and destroying and taking power over. He could not understand the idea of Christ, the idea of the cross, the idea that someone would be elevated through suffering and would choose that fate. Because remember, Jesus is God. He could have chosen to save us anyway, but he chose to save us through a shameful and difficult and painful and humiliating self-sacrifice. And that was something Satan could not fathom. And because he couldn't comprehend it, he was defeated by it. The Roman Catholic theologian Martin de Porres said that humility is the only weapon that Satan cannot wield, and because it's the only weapon he cannot wield, it is also the only weapon he cannot defend himself against. And that was proved true on the cross. Jesus demonstrates power and strength through weakness. In his vulnerability, he destroys the power of the powerful. In his life, he lives a life that is humble and is without any real glory or honor. And then he dies an ignominious death, but in doing so reveals himself as the King of Glory. It's the ultimate Uno reverse card that Satan thinks that he is winning, and yet in his very act of victory destroys his kingdom. And understandably, this changes everything about how we see the world. Once we realize not just what Christ has done for us, but the incredible example of humility revealed in what Christ has done, it changes our perspective entirely. So this begins with the idea of humility in our very approach to life and in our approach to other people as well. It's easy to be a Bible thumper who memorizes some Bible verses and then calls out other people for violating them. What's difficult is truly loving others and loving other people enough to respond to them in love and yes, we do call out sin, but we call out sin not from a place of hypocrisy, but from a place of being a fellow sinner. True humility deals with our own sins first. We look inward. Jesus Christ said, "Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me remove the speck from your eye,' and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Part of loving others is loving them enough to correct them with humility, to correct their sins. But in order to do that, we have to know ourselves enough and love God enough to work through our own sins first. And that's the difficulty. That's part of what makes humility so difficult, is that humility requires us to practice self-examination. And when we practice self-examination, what we end up finding is that we're wrong a lot, and we do wrong a lot. And there's a lot of things that just come naturally to us that are wrong. My wife and I have a joke that when we were Seventh-day Adventists, it was like, if you ever did anything enjoyable, instant hell. You know, if you went to a movie and you laughed, hell. If you went to a movie and you cried, hell. If you went to a restaurant and ate a delicious meal, guess what? Hell. If you were miserable all day, also hell, because you're supposed to have joy. So, but if you do have joy, hell. So, but the part of that I think, well, okay, not the part of it that's true, but the part of it that's grasping for something that is true is that very often in our sinfulness, we live our lives as Saint Job, the much suffering, said, it's we drink down sin like it was water. Sin is all around us and taints everything in our existence to the point where very often we don't even know that we're sinning. And as a result, it can be very difficult when we begin a process of true self-examination, because our default reaction is to try to justify ourselves. And this is why so many people fall short of a real relationship with God, because when our relationship with God is a lot of what contemporary Christian music is, which is just emotional experiences and, talking about Jesus as my happy boyfriend and all these things, that's not a real relationship. We find real relationship in something more like the Psalms, where it goes down into the depth of what it's like to be a person and to experience suffering and to wonder where God is in that. And that's where we find God, is in reaching out to him and asking him these probing questions and bringing all of our desires to him. Recently, a friend of mine asked me to pray for him because the new Godzilla movie was supposed to be released, I think, last month, and it's not being released until next month in the country in which he lives. And I told him I was so encouraged by the fact that he was coming to me to ask me to pray for something, not only because I myself am a Godzilla fan, but asking me to pray for something that most people would think of as just trivial, because there's a powerful lesson in that about the level to which God loves us. God loves us enough that we can go to him and tell him all about the video games we like and the novels we like to read and all these things. And God delights to hear that. And simultaneously, there's a sense in which God also wants us to take to him all the things we hate, all the things that are difficult for us, and all the people who are difficult for us. Jesus says that if we don't forgive our brothers, we won't receive forgiveness. But I don't think he tells us that because he wants us to just feel guilt all the time about not, or to not pray because we know that we haven't forgiven someone. No, he wants us to bring that to him. Go to him and say, God, this person is always bothering me, and I find it really hard to forgive them. I don't think I have forgiven them, and I want to experience your forgiveness. I've experienced your love. I want to share that love with them. But part of me doesn't want to share that love with them. Part of me wants to share hate with them. Part of me wants to let the hate flow through me. Because hate brings suffering, and suffering builds character. So we have to learn how to have real humility. So how do we do that? How do we start this journey? The Holy Fathers say that unless we humble ourselves, the Lord will not stop humbling us. He will use someone in order to humble us. Someone will provoke our anger and do it until we learn to remain calm and peaceful when provoked. When we can stay calm when someone attacks us from all sides, when we can keep our inner peace in spite of that person's rudeness, then our soul will become meek and humble, and we will live this life with full understanding of it. And our neighbors will tell us, you have changed. You used to have a fiery temperament, but now you have somehow become calm and dispassionate. So that actually is so my wife has not read this book yet, but she and I actually had this conversation not terribly long ago. She said to me that she was very proud of me for this exact thing. She had seen that over the course of our marriage, particularly the last few years since I've been Orthodox, because before that I was a terrible person, I have gone from being a person who was very impetuous, very impatient, always grumpy about something or other, to being a person who's very patient and loving with her. Or I think she actually used the word tries to be very patient. I think that was her exact wording, but I like to focus on the positive. But you see, humility is where we find victory over sin, but it's in learning to challenge our sinfulness that we learn humility. So there's a beautiful cycle that happens with this, because you'll notice that it starts with repentance, and it starts with just acknowledging, God, I'm an angry person. God, I'm a cowardly person. God, I'm a insert bad adjective here person. And then once you've acknowledged that aspect of that difficulty, that struggle, and brought it to God, just the process of that self-examination and that waging war against that sin, saying, I've been impatient, I'm not going to be impatient anymore. When bad things happen and people are rude to me, I'm going to be patient with them. Or I've been a cowardly person and I haven't I haven't faced whatever situation. I hide under the bed, and I hear the doorbell and I hide under the bed because I'm afraid of who might be out there. And so then my Amazon packages sometimes get stolen because I don't go to retrieve them fast enough. So I'm going to face that, and next time the doorbell rings, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to get that Amazon package. And then, hopefully this isn't the time where it happens to be mass assailant out there. Because that would be a terrible, terrible first experience for the agoraphobe. But nevertheless, the point is that in working to change those difficult aspects of ourselves, we find that that's where we cultivate humility. And the most important way to cultivate humility is to respond with kindness to others. To cultivate empathy for other people is to cultivate humility within ourselves. Because the more we learn how to see the world from someone else's perspective, the less we are trapped within our own pride. And this is actually something that for my own life, I have struggled a lot with empathy. Not so much with, like, if I see someone in pain, then I can empathize with that. But more just, I have always struggled to see things from someone else's perspective, to put myself in someone else's shoes. One of my favorite jokes growing up was, before you judge someone, you should walk a mile in their shoes, because then you're a mile away from them when you judge them and you have their shoes. So I always loved that joke, but the reality behind my love of that joke is that I really didn't understand how to metaphorically walk in someone else's shoes. I didn't understand how to try to see the world from their perspective. And what happens when you aren't able to see the world from someone else's perspective is that when they insult you, you feel the insult against you. But when you begin to see the world from someone else's perspective, something amazing happens. And when people insult you, you start to ask yourself, why do they think that? What is motivating this perspective of theirs? And it changes the way you perceive the person. It doesn't make it easier to hear insults, but it does make it easier to love people who insult us and who wrong us. But this is definitely not something that comes naturally to us. And it doesn't come naturally to us because we have self-preservation instincts. Christianity isn't about self-preservation. And so a lot of things that we learn in Christianity are very difficult because we want to preserve ourselves. When someone is insulting us and threatening us, there's real fear, and that doesn't make you a terrible person. That fear is something real. But being able to take our thoughts captive, being able to, as we've been talking about, change the way we think is the way that we are able to change the way we respond to other people. So we have to take every thought captive to Christ. And then when we do that, we see that over time, that cultivates within us a different perspective on the people around us and a different kind of humility. Many of the Puritans had a famous saying that was, "But for the grace of God, there go I." And that was a way, most of the Puritans weren't overly humble, but that was a way that they recommended cultivating humility. And I think that when we apply that, it can work. When we understand that if I had the same upbringing as someone else and the same temperament and the same dispositions, then I would struggle with the same temptations. When we think about that, it's very difficult to judge another person and think evil concerning them, because we realize that if it weren't for God preserving me, I would be in the same place. And, I mentioned before that for most of my life, I have not been a particularly good person. And in a lot of ways, I have a lot of regrets because of that. But there are other ways in which I think it has actually made me better able to love other people now, because I know that if I hadn't come into the Orthodox Church when I did, I would still be the same person that I was then, because I always wanted to change, but I didn't have the resources to change. And so I like to think that most people are in that same boat. They want to change, they want to do better in life, but they either don't have or are afraid to grab hold of the resources that would help them. And so when we learn to think like that, we learn to stop blaming other people. And the first thing we have to do is stop blaming other people for the things we do. If I'm creating clutter and then someone says to me, "Why are you creating clutter?" And I say, "Well, most of this isn't even my stuff." I don't care if it's the King of England's stuff, man. You're still the one putting it on my desk, So when you blame other people, you're not really taking accountability for yourself. And I think this is why in the liturgy we learn to say, "I am the chief of sinners." Because if I learn to look at myself as the worst of all sinners, then it's much easier to love everybody else, because nobody else is as bad of a sinner as me. So it's easy to forgive others when I think that I'm worse than they are. And this requires of us, though, an honest examination, which is difficult because even our own language is often not conducive to an honest examination. For example, we have a tendency to say, he made me angry. Whereas what we should say instead is, I got angry. I should have responded better. We say, well, I wouldn't have done X if she hadn't have done Y. Whereas what we should say is, when she did Y, it hurt me and grieved me a lot. But I should have done X instead, or I should have done A instead of X. Those are the ways when we start to change the language we use to a language of humility, it actually cultivates humility in us because it requires us to ask hard questions of ourselves. And this is actually something that even Socrates talked about. Socrates talked about when you start being cognizant of the language you're using, you start to ask yourself questions. So in my example, if I'm saying he made me angry, Socrates would say, why, instead of saying he made me angry, ask yourself, why does he have power to make you angry? Seneca said that if any man can lead you to anger, then that man has power over you. So, and obviously they're talking about the kind of anger where you lose control, not the kind of righteous anger that St. Paul talks about. Those are two different categories. Recently I had two very different encounters. One was a person who, both people heard something from me that they didn't like. One was a person who was here in this very bookstore, and I told them that we didn't have something they were looking for, and that I wasn't able to order it because I only had access to this one kind of thing, and they wanted some other kind of thing that was similar. Anyway, I didn't have the ability to order the thing that they wanted, and they responded with anger, with actual threats, with all kinds of just over the top insanity, to the point where I had to kick them out of the store. On the other hand, on the exact same day, there was another individual who was part of a group discussion that I was in, and I had told them that they needed to change the way they were interacting with some other people in the group. And that person actually responded completely opposite and thanked me for what I said because they hadn't been paying attention to how they were interacting with the other people in the group. And they ended up thanking me because I had helped them to have a more productive time in the group. And so what is the difference between those two encounters? The difference is that one person had humility and the other person didn't. That's really the only difference. Now, obviously, these are really extreme cases, but the point is, I think we can see ourselves at different points in our life in both of these individuals. And so, in the times where we're more like the gentleman who responded rightly, what is the difference? The difference is that we're acting with humility. We're allowing God to instill in us humility. On page 88, we read, God is a mystery to all beings. God is in us, and that is why we are a mystery to our own selves. God reveals himself only to the meek and humble, but he is present everywhere. And he is a mystery. We may learn a little bit about him or gather some knowledge from nature, but for the most part, we are surrounded by mystery. When a person is meek and humble, he will advance in knowledge. So this is the great paradox, in a way, that God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble in 1 Peter 5:5. God reveals himself when we are humble, and while the proud may learn about God, they may study theology and learn all kinds of facts about God. They can never learn from God, and they can never know God. They might have really great, um, really great knowledge about God and about all the particulars and all the exact phrasing that we should use to talk about the Trinity or whatever. But if they don't learn from God, then they can't know God personally, and all of that head knowledge that they have is meaningless. And this brings us back to forgiveness. Why is forgiveness so difficult? Because forgiveness requires humility. Forgiveness requires us to place God's will above our own and be able to say, and place others' good above our own. Humility requires us to be able to say, God, your will be done. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. So when we forgive someone, we are giving God his right, which is it's his right to take revenge, not our own. And this requires a serious attitude adjustment from us, because the thing is that we have to choose how we interpret the world around us. This is the heart and substance of what St. Paul is talking about when he tells us to take our thoughts captive, is changing our interpretations of the world. Because both good and bad attitudes begin in our thought life. If our thoughts are bad, our attitudes will be bad. If our thoughts are humble, then our attitudes will be humble, which will lead us to, it doesn't lead us to be like cherry pie in the sky people who just, don't see any flaws in the world around us, but it leads us to have an outlook on life that is different, an outlook where we see God's hand working in the world. And as far as both of those things, both forgiveness and our attitudes about life and about other people, a really helpful prayer is the prayer of St. Philaret of Moscow. Because if you pray the prayer of St. Philaret of Moscow every day, the basic tenor of the prayer is that you're acknowledging that all things come from God ultimately, and you're giving God glory in it and acknowledging his sovereign work, and you're basically surrendering to that and asking God to help you see that. And it really works. It really changes the way you begin to interpret the world around you. But it asks a lot from us, because it asks us to stop trying to be in control, to stop holding on to our effort to be in control of our lives. Now, another aspect of humility is humility in our limitations. For example, our limitation in knowledge. Our knowledge is like a drop in a bucket. Just look at, cosmology. We're constantly learning about stars and galaxies and all kinds of things. And our knowledge about these things is so microscopic compared to the universe. And then the irony of that word, microscopic, because the microscopic world is also infinitely complex. And one thing that is fascinating to me, or really interesting to me that I like to bring up is that Charles Darwin actually said at one point that his own theory would only be able to be taken seriously by future generations if it turned out that the cell was basically as complex as he thought it was. In fact, the word cell comes from one of the first people to examine a cell under a microscope, and it wasn't a very powerful microscope yet, and it looked like an empty space. And so when he saw it, he said it looked like a monastic cell. And that's actually where we get the word cell, is that he thought it was like a monk's cell, which is basically just a carved out room, very simple. Um, it turns out that Charles Darwin and that guy were both way off. Turns out that even the most microscopic organisms are extremely complex. And I say all of that just to say that in a macro scale, we're constantly learning new things. We're constantly seeing the complexity of the universe. We're constantly seeing that we know next to nothing. And then when we look at the microscopic and we think, well, how much could God really have contained into something so small? It turns out that it's quite a lot that he could contain into something so small. And so our knowledge is infinitesimally small there too. And so the truth is that when we stand before the ocean or look up at the stars, it's kind of cliche to say, but the truth is that it breeds humility. When you look out at some landscape and see the immensity of creation and think about the God who made it and all of the complexity that's in that too. You know, you look out at creation and you're seeing all these trees, but it's not just trees, because intellectually we know that in those trees there live all kinds of creatures. There's all kinds of raccoons and squirrels and bears and Bigfoot, because we're in the Pacific Northwest, so there's Bigfoot running around out there, and fairies and elves and all these things. It's a complex reality, and we know pretty much nothing about it, really. We've learned a lot in the last 10,000 years or whatever, since humanity has been running around avoiding Bigfoot and whatnot. But everything we've learned is still tiny. So this leads us to humility, especially before God, because God knows everything and God created everything. Father Thaddeus reminds us humility is a divine property and the perfection of the Christian life. It is attained through obedience. He who is not obedient can never attain humility. There are very few in the world today who have obedience. Our humility is in proportion to our obedience. Physical, outward humility is easier to attain than inner humility, humility of mind. That is a special gift. Our Holy Father Simeon says that a person who has attained humility of mind cannot be hurt by anything in the world. Whatever happens to such a person, they are always at peace. This is truly a divine property. Pride, too, has its levels, just as humility does. Outward pride is easy to cure, but pride of mind is almost impossible to eradicate. No one can prove to such a person that he is on the wrong track, but outward pride is curable, because one can go from riches to rags in the twinkling of an eye and become humble, even if he does not want to. So there's outward and there's inward humility. And the point, though, is that humility is in proportion to obedience. And this is why the church prescribes seasons of fasting, which I'm going to be honest is one of the hardest things for me about being Orthodox, because we have this long fast in November, December, followed up by a good time of feasting that's fairly short, followed by Lent, which is literally the strictest fast of the year. So, like, if you really know what you're doing, you're fasting half the year in Orthodoxy. And that's difficult and it's painful. And I really like food. So I really don't like fasting. But here's the thing Jesus this kind of faith can come only by prayer and fasting. And fasting matters because it's an act of obedience. And the reality is that fasting is one of many areas where we have an opportunity to show obedience. By fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays during the year, and then by prolonged fasts a few times a year, we demonstrate a willingness to subdue our will. And remember that if we're not willing to cultivate obedience, God loves us too much to allow us to go without opportunities to experience humility. And so God will send us people to prod us and annoy us and frustrate us and be difficult so that they can teach us humility. So choose fasting instead of frustrations. But when we choose obedience and labor diligently, we experience God working in us and cultivating in us humility. And this is also one of the reasons why it's important to attend church regularly and to have a spiritual father and to go to confession. All of these are things that are important because they're small acts of obedience. And the truth is, God really doesn't give us that much to obey. It seems like a lot, especially if you're coming from a Western perspective where literally nothing is required of you. And then you come into Orthodoxy, it's like, man, there's so much stuff I have to do. But there's really not that much that we're required of, or that's required of us. And all of these things are actually small acts of obedience that we can do every single day. And each one of us, a daily prayer rule, a daily study of the Bible, these are small acts that compound over time. On page 89, I think I just read that. Yeah. So the reward is greater if we have a lot to overcome. Father says, the Holy Fathers say that he who is born meek has already received his reward, but his reward will not be as great as that of the man who is quick to temper and has learned meekness through humility. Such a person will receive a great reward indeed. So we need to be encouraged because each one of us has our own struggle, but if we were just born meek, if we were just born without, and this was no struggle for us, then he who struggles little has little reward. But because God sees our great sinfulness and he sees how far short we've fallen, he also sees how our struggle is, and he delights to be with us in the struggle. Saint Anthony of Alexandria was he was fighting with demons, and they were beating him up, and he was battling, and he was in a lot of pain. And then he saw Jesus, and the demons departed from him, and he said, when were you here? And Jesus said, I've been here the whole time. And he said, why didn't you show yourself and disperse the demons? And Jesus said, because Anthony, I wanted to see how you would struggle. Now, part of us might think, well, that seems cruel. Why doesn't he just, disperse the demons and make them go away? But it's because In Anthony's struggle, he was experiencing an opportunity of humility. In Anthony's struggle, he was obtaining a reward, and Jesus loved Anthony too much to deprive him of that reward. And it's the same with us. So, as we go forward, we're going to cultivate humility through obedience, and we're going to cultivate humility through small things that compound over time every single day, and by dealing with the sinful things in our life that are the result of our pride. Because the more we challenge those things, the more we will experience growth in humility. Because in order to deal with those things, we have to cut them out at the root, and the root is pride. So I want to encourage us again that this will bring power over lust, power over hate, power over anger. These are just some examples, but it brings humility is powerful, and it will give us power over these sinful tendencies in our life. And that is mysterious. It's mysterious that something like humility is powerful, but it is. And humility is not only the end, but it's also the beginning. And it begins in our thought life. So we have to take control of our thoughts. And the more we take control of our thoughts, which is what we've been learning to do this whole time, the more we will be able to experience humility, and the more we will grow in humility. So thank you for watching, and God bless. Share this with your friends so that they too can be humbled in